was thrown out of art school because they told me that I had to stop cartooning, and I refused to stop, so they threw me out. So then after that, I went to San Francisco to collect psychedelic posters. And lo and behold, I wound up doing it. When I was 10 years old, I told my dad I wanted to buy a comic book. He took me to the dime store and gave me 10 cents for going to buy a comic. And I went in there and I looked over all the selections of comics, and I found this one comic, Mad Comics. And I was very impressed. So I bought this comic, and I came back out and I showed my dad, and I was really excited. Dad, look at this comic I got. He looked through it and he said, I don't think so, son. Why don't you take this one back and get a Superman or a Mickey Mouse? You know, a real funny book. I did what I had to do, but I said from that day forward, I too will be an underground cartoonist.
One of the main reasons that Rick Griffin's work resonated with so many people is that Rick stepped outside of everyday experience. He did things on a two-dimensional surface that do not belong on a piece of paper. You can see him channeling, cosmic forces, God, Jesus, whatever it was, psychedelics, through some unknown entity coming out of his pen and going onto the paper.
Probably the most famous example of psychedelic art is the famous eyeball image that Rick did for Jimi Hendrix. The eyeball is one of the few images I know that transcends from 60s hippies to hardcore punkers.
I think we all ripped off the flying eyeball at some part in our career. It's just a classic symbol of just rebellion or against the norm.
While I was in San Francisco, I stopped at a place called Wolfgang's Vault, which is home to the world's largest collection of 60s rock posters. It's a mind-blowing experience for anyone who's into this stuff. Most of the posters there are now worth far more than any of the artists at the time got paid to do them.
We have a lot of people who call us and want us to authenticate their posters. We keep these binders intact.
These are basically years of going over and figuring out first printing, second printing, third printing. Here's this flying eyeball in the binders. Sometimes it's a smudge, sometimes it's a mark, and they come out on every single poster, and that will delineate what's real, what's fake, what's first, what's second.
The name Wolfgang's Vault came from Bill Graham's birth name. Bill was born Wolfgang Grzyonka and changed it when he came to the States. After Bill Graham died, we bought the assets. The entire archive was in a warehouse, and they were stacked and kept well, but more by coincidence than anything else.
He has a first printing in very nice condition, one of the hardest posters to find in good condition. He's got first printing without the blue. He has an off print where, the colors just didn't match up quite right. He's got different shades with missing colors, and then he goes to the second printing. He's got one of those. He's got another second printing. He's got a bootleg copy in here just to show how to differentiate that between a second printing. It's an art. Poster printing is an art.
Out of all the artists in the 60s, I think Moscoso is probably my favorite just because of the psychedelic colors and the use of color, and you can kind of trip out and not even be on drugs.
I used to look at his work. I think the first time I saw it, I was on LSD, at some little zany comic that they had in the 60s and 70s, and just thinking, then later on, seeing it when I was completely square and straight, and realizing, no, I wasn't imagining that. This really is the way it looks. And he really was evoking this other state of mind that is not in the square world.
I started out trying to be in the museums and stuff like that, valuable to the rich. Forget it, didn't happen. When I dropped out of that and went into popular art to make a living, the Museum of Modern Art in New York came knocking on my door. How about that? My schooling got in my way. I had learned that a poster should transmit its message quickly and simply. I had learned that lettering should always be legible. I had learned not to use vibrating colors because they're irritating to the eyes. I had learned all the wrong lessons for doing these kinds of posters. So what I did is I turned them upside down so that lettering became as illegible as possible. A poster should not transmit its message quickly and simply. It should take as long as possible. Use vibrating colors wherever and whenever you can and irritate the eye as much as possible. That's how you get attention. People from across the street would see this thing pulsing and cross the street. My intention was to grab people from across the street and make them come over to wherever the poster was and look at it. Not only look at it, but try to figure out what it said.
Victor was a highly cerebral artist. He could take red, blue, and green, and then when you shine red, blue, and green lights on it, flashing, the thing would move.
When the red gel comes over this image, you don't see the red. You only see the blue, and the blue tends to get dark. It reads as a relative black. When the blue gel comes over it, you don't see the blue. You only see the red, which becomes a relative black. A friend of mine had a hallway that was covered with posters and lit with Christmas tree lights, blinking Christmas tree lights. He comes to me and he says, "Hey Victor, that poster that you did for the doors, the lady flies." I said, "Really?" The moment he said it, I knew what I had done. I went home, I made a light box. Sure enough, she flew. It was only an accident once. The second time, it's a design.
Most people don't think of Detroit when they think of 60s rock. But the truth is, many of the bands coming out at that time also went to Detroit after hitting the West Coast. The city has always been a hotbed for music, dating back to the famous Motown era. And it's home to several ballrooms, one of which is called the Grandy Ballroom. The Grandy was the center of Detroit's psychedelic scene, and many of its posters were done by an artist in the scene named Gary Grimshaw.
One thing that does get overlooked that people don't understand about Detroit is that the automobile industry didn't make Detroit. Detroit made the automobile industry. This is a big place for stove manufacturing and the proximity to raw materials in the Great Lakes and the steel mills, but most importantly, the skilled labor and the craftsmen who were here. So there's this long history of craftsmanship, and a lot of that plays into the art that you see in Detroit. My first job actually was the first Grandy Ballroom poster. My best friend was Rob Tyner. He was the lead singer of the MC5, and Russ Gibb, who started the Grandy Ballroom, hired the MC5 to be the opening act for the ballroom. And it was all ages. There was no alcohol. Most of the people that went there were high school kids.
When I was in high school, every week they put out the Grandy Ballroom flyers and handbills. I'd always get them, and in my classes when I should have been studying, I was drawing my own handbills for these shows, kind of based on Gary's style.
The posters reinforced visually the scene that was going on in the ballroom. If the Grandy Ballroom hadn't done any posters and just put on the shows, it would be really hard to go back and figure out what the hell happened there. But since there was a card or a flyer or something done for every show, you could reconstruct the whole history of it.
The cultural explosion that happened in America in the 60s only lasted for a few years. It was a time when artists were doing what they did for the love of it, creating scenes based on what they believed in. The scene soon saw its end, and with it died the rock poster art, for a while at least.
The scene was like really beautiful, and it was raging on, and we were having these great dance hall concerts, and everybody was dancing every night, and the media picked up on it. And all of a sudden we had our pictures in Life magazine and Look magazine, and here was San Francisco scene, everywhere. And so all the crazies came from everywhere. And what happened was like it was all these destitute kids coming to San Francisco with no money and nowhere to live, and they're just on the street begging, and the heroin moved in, and the scene got dark, and then Martin Luther King got shot, and there was racial strife. Haight Street got dangerous to be on. Bobby Kennedy got killed, and it just got bad, and it dissolved.